if people were to be taught how to be a servant leader, not only in IT, but in general. Imagine if all of our politicians had that mentality. Imagine if all of our doctors had that mentality. When you realize that the leadership position is a position of servitude, that you are there to serve the people that you are leading, that you are there to facilitate their success, we wouldn't live in a broken world. We wouldn't have the problems we have in the world right now. We just wouldn't. Welcome to the Leaders in Tech podcast. We dedicate this podcast to honor people that are changing this world for a better place, especially with leadership in technology. And today we have with us a great example of those leaders. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Steve, for the audience, can you please give me your full name? Where do you live and what do you do for a living?
Certainly. My name is Steve Auld, and I live in Garden City, Missouri, which is about an hour south of Kansas City. I've been an IT manager and developer for over 30 years, and currently working for NBH Bank in Kansas City.
That's fantastic, and I cannot wait to figure out how you made it this far in your career. Have you been in the banking industry for long?
I've been in and out of the banking industry. My first job in tech was in the credit card industry, so an arm of the banking industry. And over the 30 plus years, I've been in 4 different financial type institutions, both between credit card, investment, and more brick and mortar banks.
That's wonderful. Steve, a lot of our audiences are people that are looking for their next step in their life, in their career. And especially considering technology as now is one of the strongest industries in the market. What was in your thoughts when you were finishing high school? How do you make the jump into computer science?
That's a great story, David. At the time I was finishing high school, my thoughts were I wanted to be a brick and mortar architect. I wanted to design buildings and draw plans. And it was something that was really passionate for me. The funny thing is, the computer industry was very, very young back then. That would have been 1982, if I can age myself. My mother had the foresight, and it was, she kept telling me, I think you should look into this computer thing. I think there's going to be something there. And at the time, that was really of no interest to me back in high school.
So you had no interest in computers back then?
Other than the fact that we could play a game in our study hall off of one of the old, I think it was an old IBM, and it just looked like a giant typewriter that you entered a couple of options into, and it played out an American football play. So you'd put in a couple options, and your opponent would put in a couple options, and the computer would think about it. It would print out what happened. That was about it. That was about my interest back then.
Little did we know that it was going to run the economy 30 years later, eh?
Exactly.
Crazy.
Exactly.
Tell me something that is not touched by computers. I was interviewing a senior VP or one of the largest universities in the States. He's a senior VP for IT in that university, but he grew up in a farm. And he tells me that farming nowadays in North America is ruled by computer science and, internet devices, GPS technology, you name it, it's everywhere.
Exactly. It's funny you would mention farming because my previous job was with a company called Seaboard Foods, and they are in the hog and pig raising and harvesting, and but they're very old school. They know that technology was something they needed, but they also knew that if something wiped all technology off the planet, pigs were still going to grow, and they were still going to need to be harvested, and they could, they still have to figure out a way to do things without it. So, but they sure like having it when it's there.
And he's not far-fetched, right? Like I remember we had solar flares in Canada in I think it was the mid-90s or late 90s. And it fried a large part of components in one of the provinces. and they went dark for many days.
I remember that
So,
big Northeast blackout. Yes.
right? So if you think about it, it just takes a solar storm to fry every single electrical device in our society. And then we go back to the 1800s like this.
And we've been having a lot of those lately. So.
Yep. Yeah. Just imagine the thought. Like I still carry cash in my wallet just because I'm old school. But honestly, it's mostly to give it away, right? Because I'm looking, sometimes I get homeless people and my heart is with them. So I bless them with whatever I have. But most of my purchases are with credit cards
Right.
and debit cards and internet transactions. It's all virtual.
It is. Even when one of my cards quit partially working, it wouldn't let me tap it anymore. And even then, you find yourself a little bit handicapped. So yes, we get so reliant on this technology that, like you said, it's kind of a sombering thought to think that one solar flare could take it away from us for a little bit, or who knows how long.
It's crazy. So tell me, did you actually graduate as an architect, or what happened in university?
No, so when I went to university, I started my studies as an architect, and just over the first 3 years of a 6-year program, just kind of the passion went away for it. And so I found myself not really knowing what the next step was. And so I thought, well, what better place to figure things out? I signed up and enlisted in the United States Air Force, where I served for 6 years. While I was in the Air Force, I was an air traffic controller, which was something I really liked a lot and enjoyed immensely. And my plan was, when I got out of the Air Force, was to do that for the Federal Aviation Administration. My timing was very bad for that. In the fall of 1991, which is when I was going to be getting out, the FAA instituted a hiring freeze, and that lasted for many years, and I never got the chance to do that. But that's when I got lucky enough to fall into IT.
Now, being an air traffic controller, though, it must have required some technology. Like, can you describe how did you fell into that, and what was your training like? Because that job is fascinating to me.
Well, I mean, the technology is largely in the radars and a lot of verbal communication. I mean, there is that technology is changing all the time with how they track aircraft through the use of their transponders, and how air traffic controllers from the tower to the radar rooms to the what we call the air traffic centers, which handle the large overflight traffics. That communication is very solid and has been for many years. So, I mean, technology-wise, it's much stronger in human cognizant functioning. How good of a puzzle player are you? I mean, how good are you at puzzles? In my job, I was working in the tower itself, so we had control of a 3-mile radius of airspace up to 3,000 feet. And as aircraft came in, and I'm working on a military base, you may have just one plane at a time, or you may suddenly find yourself with 15 aircraft that all want to do many, many different things, and you have to work out the puzzle of, okay, how am I going to allow all these people to do what they want in a safe and timely manner? So it really came down to that problem-solving skills, which really lend themselves well to becoming a programmer and eventually a manager and leader in IT.
That's true. So for the people that are listening, if you love solving problems, you're one of those persons that get enthusiastic about a puzzle and you think you have a way to figure it out. That's computer science for you.
Yes. In fact, David, right? I like to joke. Yes. And one of my jokes is that, we'll be working with business partners and they've got this desperate thing they need done. And they think it's life and death. And I will remind them that it is not. I have worked actual life and death. My prioritization skills are top notch because of that. We will get through this together.
That's beautiful. It's well said. And I think you are blessed because of your military experience. I was blessed to be in the military for 2 years too. And you really quickly get to realize what really matters in life. Right?
Yes, you do. You realize that there are some jobs that you might not go home from that night. And then there's a lot of jobs, the vast majority of jobs that, you're going to go home that night. Your work may be waiting for you in the morning again, but everything is okay.
I remember one time, it was one of my first jobs as a technology leader, and I had responsibility for the entire department in the software side. And one of the main databases went down, 2,000 employees. We had, coast to coast presence. And I thought I was going to die. I literally thought this was it. Like the fear that I had, me being the responsible for this whole thing, was overwhelming. Until my boss came, the senior vice president came, and he sat me down and he says, "Do you think you're helping anybody with your attitude? I put you in this position because you are supposed to be the leader, and the leader is the one that knows how to prioritize, and the one that has the attitude that everything can be done and everything will be resolved. So stop wasting your anxiety and your energy in stuff that is not going to help the problem."
Right.
So basically, he changed my mindset. And he says, the leaders find a way. You are a leader because if you have a huge wall in front of you, you can either dig a tunnel underneath, or jump over it, or go around it, or grab enough people to break it through.
Like to say, be like a duck, remain calm on the surface, but your little feet are churning under the water to get things done and get you to where you need to be. But you don't have to show everybody that you're, your anxiety is high or you're frustrated or anything like that. You keep your duck attitude and just keep paddling.
And sure enough, 24 hours later, the problem was resolved. We actually became the heroes because it wasn't a technical issue. It was an attack, and we were able to survive the attack. And this is like 30 years ago, right? 25 years ago. We already had cyber attacks. We were able to survive. We restored a couple of tables from backup. We probably lost 3-4 hours of work, which was a big deal, but it wasn't the end of the business or the end of my job. But like you said, are you going to be worried because of that? Or are you going to be worried because you're in the battlefield and your best friend, you just got wounded and you have to carry him back to safety?
Exactly. Everything has to be kept in the right perspective.
That's incredible. Okay, so you went out of the military and you said the recession wouldn't allow you to have a job, right?
Yeah, the FAA had instituted a hiring freeze, and so there were no jobs available, which is why a couple weeks ago it was very, very ironic to me when the FAA came out and said, "Oh, we're short so many air traffic controllers, we need people." Well, now I'm too old. They won't hire me. I'm too old for them to hire me. But it was kind of bittersweet. I guess it was fate's way of telling me that, it was just never meant for you. But fortunately, as I took up a full-time job to make ends meet, I was working for a credit card company, and we were working on, I was handling all of the deceased accounts and the bankrupt accounts. And through that, I was building spreadsheets in Lotus 1-2-3 with WYSIWYG.
That was a first exposure to technology.
Yeah. And apparently with macros and things that I was figuring out how to build in that, the IT manager of that secured credit card company noticed possibilities. And so she offered me a job as a programmer. At the time, they were using Fox Base. And she hired me and sat me down in front of a computer at that beautiful blue screen and white letters, and opened up a program, and she said, "This isn't working. Figure it out." And that's how my programming career started back in 1992.
Isn't that beautiful? Without any IT training, with no computer science degrees, just the attitude and the ability to figure it out, right?
Correct. And that's why a lot of times today when I'm hiring for a new developer, there's so many skills you're looking for in any particular role. and you're never going to find anybody that has 100% of those exact skills that you need. So I weigh a huge portion of the matrix on this person's ability and willingness to learn, and how they can convey that to me during an interview.
Yeah, I've been running my own business, ISU Corp, for 18 years. We write software for banks and insurance companies and e-commerce sites. They don't hire us for what we know. They hire us because they know we're the best at learning what needs to be learned. We are the best at researching what's the best solution for them. And we pick it up like this and we figure it out. It's crazy because I have that attitude since I started my own business, because my first job, I have 2 computer science degrees. The first one was all focused on mainframes. When I got out of that, it was already obsolete because microcomputers took over in the 90s. I graduated in 1989, I think, 1990, the first time. Then I moved to Canada just to realize that everybody were using microcomputers. So I went back to school. I got another computer science degree, learning how to do client-server programming and microcomputer languages without a mainframe, without a dumb screen, actually having intelligent clients. And I thought I knew it all. And I'm like, here I go, getting my first job. And I had to send 300 resumes. Back then, snail mail, no email, right? And I got 5 job interviews out of those. It took like 6 months, 5 job interviews. And out of those, I got 1 job. And when you saw what the job listed, the languages they wanted to hire for, I had 1 out of 5. So I only sent the resume because I thought, who cares? They're not going to call me anyway.
But you might get on their radar, and then look what happened.
Right? And when I got the job, they opened a DCL mainframe. It was a back system. The operating system was called DCL. Never heard of it in my life. All my experience with AS400s and other mainframes. And here I was. And you want to know, my boss told me, this program is not working. Figure it out.
Figure it out.
And he gave me a manual this big, a huge manual this big.
But that's always going to be the job. Even when I hire, new people today, they may know the languages, but they don't know the code base. They don't know the architecture that they're coming into. And it's still a very large portion of, okay, it's not working, or they need this change. Figure out how to make that happen.
Research. For me, you want to be a good coder, a good computer scientist, fall in love with solving problems and learn how to do exceptional research. Right?
Right.
Did you ever have somebody, since you didn't go to school for computer science, did you have anybody at the beginning that was teaching you how to write code or how to do it better?
Not really. When my first IT boss sat me down in front of that program, there was not a lot of guidance as to, nomenclature or structure. Of course, back then it was, all procedural. It was just top-down programming. And, there were tips and hints here and there for, tracking progress and things like that. I'm still very good friends with that. The gal I worked with back then to this day, and I love her like a sister, but she was a terrible programmer. he would create programs and then just hit run, and the screen would just go blue for hours, and you didn't know, is it running? Is it not running? There's no counters, no nothing going on to let you know that it was making any progress whatsoever, and you just sat there and waited for an hour or two to see if it came back, to the prompt. And we always got after her for that. But it's jokingly, myself and the other programmer that worked there. But, I never really had a strong programming mentor that, sat down with me, co-wrote with me or anything like that, and then talked me through structure. When we got to object-oriented programming, that was largely reading books, attending some classes from some of the technology partners, but a lot of it just figured out, trial and error, just doing it how it made the most sense to me, and keeping it as simple as possible. And that worked really well for me. And I received a lot of compliments from people who would then take over my code later and say, your code makes so much sense. It's so easy to follow. It's so easy to understand what you're doing. And so it's that whole keep it simple, stupid methodology. I guess that's done me well for most of my programming career.
You know what, Steve? One of the things that, now that you mentioned that, one of the Steve's that I like this most is inheriting the code of a very genius programmer that was completely unreadable. Oh, the maintenance nightmare. Like, once I remember, like, this guy wrote an entire class in 2 big long lines of code, and he did it just to actually make us think that he was the best programmer in the world. And it was literally like, when they put it apart, I had to rewrite it, and it took 2 pages of code to write that.
I remember that too. As object-oriented programming was getting very popular, I worked with several other programmers that thought every program had to use every concept available to make them look like they were the most intelligent programmers on the team. And like you said, they became maintenance nightmares because you could not really follow what they were doing with any ease whatsoever.
You know what mistake I did as a junior developer, though? I remember in my first professional job, I grew really fast. Before I knew I was in charge of 2,000 teachers in my school district. I was a programmer for the school board of education. And I was always writing comments, commenting my code all the time. But when I was about to leave that job, my boss actually moved up to a multinational, and he hired me up. But when I gave my notice, I had to do a code review with my peers. And then my immediate boss told me, you have 2 weeks to replace every comment that you did in Spanish and put it in English. I was commenting all in Spanish.
There's no translate button like they have in Windows, or that's too bad.
I learned my lesson pretty quick.
Curse of being multilingual, David.
What a joy, eh? When was the first time that you had the privilege of managing other people, and how do you accomplish that?
The first time I had the privilege of managing other people, I was working for a small student loan insurance company called HEMAR Insurance. And what they do is they insure the repayment of student loans for doctors, lawyers, MBAs, professional level degrees. And it was a small shop in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we had 3 programmers plus myself. But I was also in charge of the network. Back at the time, it was a Novell network, and making sure all the, daily, weekly backups are being done. And, by then the programming was being done in Visual Fox Pro at that group. And, it was a group of very similar ages. A lot of us were in our late 20s to mid 30s working there. So a lot of common ideas, common thought processes around programming. Fox Pro had a lot of constraints to it, that a lot of strong guardrails for you to program within, and had a really good team that we had a lot of work to do. And that's where I started learning how to manage resources. How many projects do we have going on? How many, what are the deadlines like? What are the resources and their expertise to accomplish these requests in the required timeline? And, that's where I really got my start in being that, I didn't know it was a thing at the time, but being that servant leader and being that conduit between business executives and the IT developers, programmers, analysts.
Okay, can you expand a little bit on what do you mean by servant leader? That's
servant
profound.
leadership. Yes, servant leadership you most hear in the agile space today. As a servant leader, I'm not there. When I hire a programmer, I expect them to know as much, if not more, than I do. I do not get in their way. I don't go into code and tell them you need to do this like this. This is how you get from A to B to C. As a servant leader, my job is to make sure they're assigned the proper roles. They're, handling their responsibilities correctly. They're working with the people they need to work with. And then when they need things, they come to me. I serve them as the person to get roadblocks out of the way. If they're having trouble getting the right people into a meeting, they come to me, and I will make sure the meeting gets arranged, because unfortunately there's still places and people out there that won't respect certain levels of an organization if they're requesting a meeting. But if it comes from a manager or a director or a C-level person, they're snapping right into that meeting right away. So as a servant leader, my job is to make sure my people have the proper work, they have the proper tools, and all roadblocks are out of their way. And I don't get in their way. I'm very hands off. It's that whole trust but verify. I follow up, meet with my team at least every other week with one-on-ones where we can follow up. But even with the one-on-ones, the leadership style I was taught is that a one-on-one is really the employees meeting. It's their agenda. What do they need to talk about? If I have things to pass on, I will use the time at the end of the meeting after their agenda has been gone through, and then we'll discuss anything that I need to discuss with them. And the feeling there is that we get to the end of the year and it's annual review time, the big scary annual review. We've been talking about anything throughout the entire year, and there's no surprises coming at their annual review. And so to me, that's servant leadership in a nutshell. That I am there to make sure my team has what they need to get the job done, and if they don't, I make sure I get that for them.
That's you just touched on the key secret of any exceptional leadership. If people were to be taught how to be a servant leader, not only in IT, but in general, imagine if all of our politicians had that mentality. Imagine if all of our doctors had that mentality. When you realize that the leadership position is a position of servitude, that you are there to serve the people that you are leading, that you are there to facilitate their success, we wouldn't live in a broken world. We wouldn't have the problems we have in the world right now. We just wouldn't.
It would be a far different place. Right? I have had the honor of working with some really great people, even my current team, a fantastic team of people, and they know their stuff much better than I do. And but there's still people out there. I have a very good friend in Nebraska in the IT industry, and he just keeps landing with the worst kind of managers. And to him, the word manager is just the dirtiest word you could ever say. In fact, he has a hard time saying it, and every time he says it in front of me, he kind of cringes. We've been friends for almost 40 years, and but he keeps winding up with that other kind of boss that just wants to control everything, wants the first, middle, and last say on anything that's being done, and they don't want their people to succeed. They don't want their people to grow, because then their people might expand beyond them. And it makes my stomach sick when I know especially a good friend like that who's stuck in a situation because he's a fantastic technical resource, but he's had managers that make him think he's not, and that's a extra motivation for me to continue to manage the way I do.
And that explains why you have gone so far in your career, because it's inevitable, right? You are going to encounter different types of leadership in your career, but we're called to follow the best, not the worst. And we have to be very careful. Who do we choose our mentors? most of my mentors don't know they were my mentors. I just chose to follow certain leadership style that I knew it worked. But I actually fell on that trap. I also learned from other people that they thought that by being proud, by them considering themselves the best, were the best leaders. And those are those horrible managers that you're describing, right? When they say nobody's better than me and nobody has a better intelligence than I do, and I used to be the best programmer. That's number one. It's what a horrible way to live. Number two, you're not going to get anybody efficient in your team, because where the head goes, the whole body follows. So that style of leadership will actually corrupt the entire organization. Businesses have gone bankrupt because of that, actually.
Exactly. For following the head when it should not have been. Yes.
Right? Or the head is bad, right? So you have to change the head. You have to change the leadership. For me, I've been reading my Bible lately a lot. And if you want to follow and learn how to be one of the best leaders, just follow the life of Jesus Christ. You don't even have to be a believer. Just follow Jesus as a leader. And you'll realize how he came to serve.
Yes, he was the servant leader. Absolutely.
Right? Yes. I remember that passage where he knelt down and he grabbed a bucket of water and a towel, and he started washing his disciples' feet. Serving, like in servitude. I'm like, what? He was God made human. He came to serve us. It's the greatest lesson if you want to become an exceptional leader in technology. Right?
Absolutely.
Tell me, what has been the toughest situation, the hardest situation as a leader, and how did you overcome it?
Wow, my hardest situation as a leader. I think probably one of the hardest situations I have come across is when you're working with an employee and you're trying to mentor and you're trying to help an employee understand, kind of like we just talked about with some managers that just, they think they know it all, and they think that they're, God's gift to IT and programming and such. That, I've had an employee in the past who was a good worker, solid worker, did good work, got things done, but he thought he was a lot more than what he really was. And you'd get to we'd have our one-on-ones, but you'd get to annual review time, and he would just rate himself at the very top of the rating scale all across the board. And, it was kind of that walk on water situation. But still a solid, fantastic employee that you don't want to lose. But, how do you work through that situation that you have to bring them back down a little bit to reality without completely crushing their soul, as you're just trying to reset expectations. I do a lot of that these days, resetting expectations. So always working with the human psyche. And when you've got someone who's very proud, thinks very highly of themselves, maybe too highly of themselves, and working with them through that situation, I think that's one of the toughest things I come across as a manager, because I am not schooled in psychiatry or psychoanalyst or anything like that. Just trying to not be parental, but almost have to use those parental skills when working with a child, of having the conversation that, I like how you work. I think you're a solid employee. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, we're average is a 5. You're a solid 7 to 8, but you're not 10s across the board. Mm-hmm. We all have opportunities to grow. To me, somebody who's a solid 10 across the board has no opportunity to grow anymore. And having those kind of conversations with him, that's a tough one, because again, you don't want to break someone's spirit when they're still an employee you wish to retain and work with. Mm-hmm. But you also want them to understand that they've got room to grow. They don't know it all, and they need to come back down to earth a little bit.
take it down a couple of notches, and it's
Couple of
dangerous,
notches.
right? Because it's
Yep.
the same as an employee, right? If you fill yourself with ego, thinking that you know it all, it's very hard for you to keep moving forward and to grow. How can you grow if you've reached your top
Right.
capacity,
You'll
right?
just keep doing things exactly the same way because you think that's the only way you should be done, and it's perfect because you're perfect, and you'll never look for new methods, methodologies, standards, and you'll never grow.
I was talking with another senior leader in technology yesterday, and she mentioned that reading this book helped her a lot in her psychology towards treating her employees. Have you ever heard about this book called The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman?
I have heard of it. I have not read it.
So it's a book for marriages in trouble. It's not a leadership book. But the book, if you read the book, what it actually shows you is that people have different ways of receiving information. And their triggers are different. Their emotional triggers are different. So that if you apply that book to your leadership skills, I read the book like 5 times. And yesterday it really clicked that it actually is helping me treat my employees better, because what motivates you is not necessarily the same thing as somebody else in your team. Right?
No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, fortunately, I haven't had to read it for my marriage. We were just married 36 years last week, so
wow.
all is good there.
Congratulations.
But I can see where the premise of the book and learning how other people are triggered, how other people listen, and how other people want to be addressed could go a long way in leadership, and having those kind of conversations with the different types of people we deal with.
That is amazing. Steve, what would you say to the 30-year-old version of you? If you had access to a time machine and you could go back, imagine when you were 30 years old, if you were going through trouble, what would you tell yourself?
Go back 30 years to myself. I guess I would tell myself to, keep learning. And, I'm very happy with how my life and my career has gone. It took me a few years after I was 30 to realize that a lot of the leadership that I learned and have known most of my life came from my father. And because he was always our sports coach, and he was a leader in the business community where we grew up. And, he didn't hesitate, even as children, that he was a CPA managing partner of a large CPA firm. And if he had dinner with big clients, we kids went, and we were expected to hold conversations with his clients.
Wow.
And, and it was that trust and that, the leadership that he showed me that I didn't realize he was showing me as a child, that helped me get to where I am today. And so if I went back 30 years before I really started to process that fact that, a lot of what I'm doing, I watched my dad do for years, I would just remind myself and maybe start saying to myself more, what would my dad do as a leader in situations like this? And what decisions would he make? Now, luckily, 30 years ago, I still had the opportunity to ask him those questions and ask him what he thought of things. But, to this day, I do that more and say to myself, well, what would my dad have done in this situation? Because he was probably in it similarly. And, just follow what's been ingrained in you since you were a child. And, especially if you had a mentor, a father like I did that was very involved, always trying to better everyone he was around. And, it worked really well for him, and so it was a great blueprint to follow.
That's wonderful. And it's thank you. What a beautiful insight. I was also blessed with having a very wise father, a leader himself. I remember one time my business was going under back in 2008 during the crisis, and I went crying to my dad. He was still alive. I said, Dad, I don't know what to do with this business. Should I close it? Should I go get a job again? And he asked me, is it still paying your salary? And I'm like, yeah. Then just keep going. Shut your brain down and put yourself to work twice as much, and you'll get through this. And sure enough, I got through it. And I think the lesson, because I know you and I are privileged to have had wonderful fathers that became our mentors. Some people don't have that privilege, but they can actually learn that if you want to get somewhere in life, the easiest way to get there is to find somebody that has gone through what you're going through, and they are where you want to be, and ask them how they did it.
Right. The whole purpose of this podcast.
Exactly. Yes. Oh, wow.
The other thing I would probably add to that, though, David, is the next big boost I got in my leadership philosophy was when I worked at GoDaddy. And at the time, Bob Parsons was the owner of GoDaddy. And his philosophy truly was, you hire people smarter than you are, and you get out of their way. And, it obviously worked fantastically well for him. I've tried to follow that mantra ever since. Again, part of the reason why after I hire a programmer, I'm not telling them, write it like this, because I'm hiring you because I think you know a lot more than I do. And I want you to prove it to me now. But, his leadership style, he knew his stuff very well. And he knew if you were trying to get something by him, and he knew if you were on the right track. But he'd stay out of the way, let you do your thing, let you run your own business. And the boss I work for today at NBH Bank, when he hired me, he said, if you're going to ask me what I need you to do in your first 60 or 90 days, I'm going to tell you right now. He says, this is your business. Run it as you would. And that's, largely the direction he's given me. And that was 4 years ago now. He's been in IT. He was in the military as well, but he was more on the network and communication side. So he doesn't know anything about the programming side of things, and he doesn't expect to have to. That's my job. And, that's the kind of leadership I've been blessed with working for a lot. I think part of my career success has been that I know the people I want to work for. I know the type of person I want to work for. And I ask the right questions during an interview to find out that the person who's thinking of hiring me, if they're the kind of person that I want to work for.
And that's another profound piece of wisdom right there. Life is so short, especially if the audience is listening, that you guys are under 25 or under 30 years old. Don't think that life is long. 30 years go by like a drop of water. It's so fast. Don't waste your time in a position where you know that you don't have the right leadership. You have a choice, especially nowadays, with the economy. Even though the economy is not as good as it used to be last year, but even now, if you consider that you're going to spend 8 to 12 hours a day working for a person, for a group, that's most of your waking life. So choose right. Yep. Choose right. And if you don't like where you are, look for another place. And it's funny, I run a company, and I don't want my people to leave. But I also don't want to be an obstacle if there is not a right fit, because I know life is very, very short. And the worst thing that you could be is when you get to the end of your life with regrets. What if I could have? What if I did this and that instead of, doing what I did? That's not a good way to finish your life.
I am very, very adamant about a strong work-life balance with my team. And that comes from one of my immediate bosses when I was at GoDaddy. She, very, very intelligent lady, but she was just a grinder. She loved work. And I was sitting in her office one afternoon, beautiful afternoon in May, and we were having our weekly one-on-one. And as I looked across the desk at her, she just kind of stopped and started breaking down. And I asked her what was wrong, and she said, you know what? Today's my oldest son's last day of high school, and I've missed it all. Being here, working, all the ball games, all the concerts, all the events. And, so like you said, you've got to enjoy what you're doing. You've got to enjoy who you're working for. You've got to enjoy your team. But I tell my team, because a lot of my team has younger children, I say, if there's a school concert, if there's a soccer game, if there's anything, you put it on your calendar, you send an email to the team, hey, I got to go to Johnny's soccer game this afternoon. I'll be out at 3:30. I tell them do it and go, because you don't get second shots at that. And,
it's true. And you know what? That creates a beautiful culture. That's why I'm so successful. Half of my staff are ladies because they have children and they do this type of events. And I know, I don't even tell them you have to recuperate your time. They do it by themselves. They feel so blessed and so thankful that they have the flexibility to go when they need to go, that they come back and they still finish the job on time.
And that is huge too. Here at NBH, the ET group, we understand that, we're 24/7. I mean, we have to keep things up and running. You never know when you're going to be called into work. So, if you have to take off 2 hours, 3 hours in the middle of the day for a child's event or something, we all know we make it up somewhere along the way. We don't have to be told to make it up. We just do.
Right.
And, there's always those weekend or overnight deployments, things like that have to be taken care of. And sometimes they go right and it's only a 10-minute thing. And sometimes they go horribly wrong and you're, online for 8 hours in the middle of the night. And, so to me, it all balances out in the wash. And I make sure the team understands that, and that, if they ask me, can I go to my kid's concert? I'm not going to say no, and I'm not going to be angry with you that you asked. So it's like you said, you've got to enjoy where you work. It's going to be a long part of your life. And as my my two kids are in their late 20s, and one has just had her second child, finding out how fast time really does go now. Because when you're in your 20s and you don't have kids or anything, time seems to just last forever. And then have a child and see how fast time really starts running.
Exactly. Steve, thank you so much for your time and all your wisdom. We're truly blessed to have you as a guest on this podcast. One last question before we finish this interview. If you had access to a billboard in front of the busiest highway on earth, what would you write in it?
Wow. Probably another one of the things that I've taken away from my time at GoDaddy is that you work hard and you play harder. Because life does go by fast, but don't live to work to live.
Yeah.
And because when you're on your deathbed and your memories are running through your mind of how your life went, you're not going to be thinking about all the jobs you had. You're going to be thinking about all the memories you made with family, friends.
Yeah. It's true. And that balance, right? Because the other side is horrible too. When you have no job and you have nothing to do, that's also horrible. So it's just find that balance, find that way where you are fulfilled in your job and also fulfilled as a parent or as a brother or sister. Thank you so much for having this time with us, Steve. If people would like to find you online, where can they find you?
David, they can find, I'm on LinkedIn, but if they want to find out what I do in the off time, we have a family farm that you can find at llamasarus.com.
Nice.
That's kind of a family job or business we run, and where I teach my children how to run businesses. And so that's the best place to catch up with everything that's going on in our life. And I want to thank you for having me on your podcast and getting to know more about myself and how I lead and how I got here.
Fantastic. Steve, God bless you. Have a beautiful rest of the week and see you around.
Thank you, David. You too.
Thank you for tuning in to the Leaders in Tech podcast. Check in next week to keep learning how to use technology and leadership to change the game. See you next time.